Reading is from the Holy Gospel according to the tradition of St. Luke. Jesus told his disciples a parable about the necessity for them to pray always without becoming weary. He said there was a judge in a certain town who neither feared God nor respected any human being. And a widow in that town used to come to him and say, "Render a just decision for me against my adversary." For a long time the judge was unwilling, but eventually he thought, "While it is true that I neither fear God nor respect any human being, because this widow keeps bothering me, I shall deliver a just decision for her, lest she finally come and strike me." The Lord said, "Pay attention to what the dishonest judge says. Will not God then secure the rights of his chosen ones who call out to him day and night? Will he be slow to answer them? I tell you, he will see to it that justice is done for them speedily. But when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth?" The Gospel of the Lord. Well, we heard in the second reading today from 2 Timothy how important the Scripture is to both inspire our lives as well as to provide us with a kind of vision that should sustain and nurture our faith itself and be incorporated into it. But you realize that our attentiveness to what we call the sacred Scripture, our Old and New Testaments, by us as Catholics, is rather novel, kind of new. I remember growing up as a boy that we rarely thought of the Scripture as anything important to our being Catholic. It was not part of our religious education experience other than to hear some of the ancient stories. But reading the Bible was not something we were encouraged to do. In fact, I can remember a nun telling me when I was a boy that if you came late for church on Sunday, that was a venial sin, she told me. And if you came at the point where the priest was taking the cover off the chalice, if you came before that happened, or after that happened, then it was mortal sin. You were missing Mass. In other words, what she was telling me, now that I look back upon it, was you could miss the whole liturgy of the Word and God barely cared. Because it wasn't important. It wasn't important. And so basically it was our reaction as a Catholic tradition to the Protestant Reformation. The Protestants stressed the Bible, not we Catholics. And they memorized it, they could repeat phrases of it, they taught from it, etc., but not us. We were taught by the Church and its teachings and its creeds, etc., and the Bible seemed to have little to do with our faith experience, at least in my youth. And that had been the case since the 16th century. In fact, I can still remember that we had at home, in our home, a rather large Bible, probably about that thick, and a big, large Bible, and it sat on one of the tables in the living room, and we never opened it. We never used it for prayer, never touched it. It looked as new as the day I'm certain it was given or was purchased for my parents. But we did use it. We put sacramental records in it. So when each of us children were baptized, that record went into the Bible. It had pages simply for that purpose. Or when you made your first reconciliation, or as we called it in those days, first confession, or first communion, etc., all that was recorded. The same thing when you got married, or if you got ordained, as I did. All that got recorded and put into the family Bible. But we never prayed with it, and nobody ever read it. In fact, when my mother died, I took that Bible and still have it. And it was kind of interesting to look through it because I realized as I started going through it that many of the pages were stuck together over the years just from moisture, etc., because nobody ever used it. Nobody ever prayed it. Nobody ever kind of really read it. It was just the place to keep records. In fact, I discovered in the back of it, she actually had a baby record for me. So she indicated there how much I weighed when I was born, the color of my eyes, etc. And a very important fact to me was I was born in March of 1945. She had said on December the 24th, 1945, I received my first haircut. So I thought, well, that's important to know. There we are. That was the use of the Bible in a Catholic home back in the 40s. And I'm sure the 50s and beyond. So we were not encouraged to do the very thing that Timothy recommends in the Scripture today, that we basically pay attention to it, that we actually read it, that we ponder it, we reflect upon it, and we try to incorporate it in our lives. The second point made by the Scripture today is that made rather strangely in the first reading, but more appropriately given to us in the parable of Jesus and the gospel, and that is we should be praying always. That prayer should be a state of being for us as Christians. Now that does not mean that we should be walking around mumbling Our Fathers and Hail Marys all the time. That's not what it means. In fact, Jesus goes out of his way to say in one of the Gospels, stop mumbling prayers like pagans. Pray, but don't mumble prayers. What did he mean? Well, for Jesus, prayer is simply a state of mind where you're always aware of God's presence to your life. So you actually have regular conversations with God as each day unwinds around the things you're experiencing in your day. Sometimes those would be questions of God, why this or that is even happening as it is. And sometimes our prayers may even be complaints of some kind. And they can also be, of course, prayers of praise or prayers of wonder. But this I sense that we should each go about our day-to-day lives as believers with an awareness of God and an engagement with that God in terms of what we are experiencing the day-to-day is what is meant by praying always. So prayer is not some kind of performance at a communal praying of the rosary or at some particular kind of moment in the church's life, some kind of devotion. Prayer is this awareness of God that constantly leads us into conversation with him. And of course it can be strengthened to the degree to which we know God. And the key to knowing God is to know the sacred scripture which reveals him to us. And so the two are intimately connected. In fact, the scripture will go on to say, you are not actually even alive if you don't know how to pray. You don't have God's life in you without it. And so that's the encouragement that each of us is made today, encouraged to make our own. I remember reading some years ago that the famous comedian Jonathan Winters, basically ended up hospitalized late in his life because he suffered a nervous breakdown. He thought that space aliens were after him and they were going to come and take him away. So he had this kind of loss of sense of reality. And so he had to be hospitalized and receive treatment. But when he got out of the hospital, cameras and microphones were there and people interviewed him about this experience. And he only said 3 words. They asked him, what did you learn as a result of your treatment after your nervous breakdown? And he said, never land alone. And I think what he was saying was actually what the scripture says to us. Never land alone. In other words, you are not alone. Never. God is always present to you. Be aware of that presence. That's what prayer is. He could have said, pray always. Never land alone was his kind of comic way of saying the very same kind of thing. And hopefully each of us can make that more a reality for our own lives. Both our attentiveness to reading and learning from the scripture, and God knows there are thousands and thousands of books that enable us to do that wisely today. And in addition, we can hopefully learn to pray always. Live each day with an awareness of God's presence to us and in and through our continuing conversation with that loving presence of God, grow in our own life of faith.